in a series of afternoon lectures sponsored by the Institute on National Affairs, this year being Humor in America. I hope you've all received a brochure. If not, you can pick one up at the back when you leave. And I'd like to remind you of tonight's lecture. Arthur Azenberger will be speaking on He Who Laughs, Laughs. And we know this conflicts with the caucuses, but we're confident that you'll be there. So on with the introductions of the speaker. Dr. Leonard Feinberg is a distinguished professor of English here at Iowa State. And he's received the Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award along with Professor of the Year Award. His studies for satire include include The Secret of Humor, Faith and Laughter, and Introduction to Satire. Now, Dr. Feinberg.
Thanks, Ken. Humor is not a subject that should be taken too seriously, and we won't waste any unnecessary energy taking it too seriously. In the first place, the title of this lecture is misleading. Nobody can definitively tell you why people laugh. The fact is that hundreds of thinkers since Aristotle have tried, and there is no agreement whatsoever on the subject. So it's unlikely that even as eminent a speaker as you have just been introduced to will make the effort. I doubt that the message I bring will wipe out all previous speculation. The title is misleading, but people like short, miniaturized titles. If I were speaking in the 19th century, a more accurate description of today's talk might have been speculations concerning the nature of laughter by various and sundry thinkers, including an eminent investigator from the heart of culture in Story County, Iowa, which is about as impressive as it sounds. I want to do several things in this talk. First, I want to tell you about some of the major theories of humor that have been proposed in the past. Then I want to tell you about my own theory of humor, which was published in a book a couple of years ago. Then I want to give a few examples from world humor, which demonstrate, I think, the validity of my theory, and if they don't, they at least demonstrate the pleasure of humor, so nothing will be lost if you don't think they prove my case. And finally, I want to relate all three previous statements to American humor, which is, in theory, the subject of this week's conference. There are about 120 separate theories of humor that have been proposed, at least at the level of being recorded in writing. There are more than that, actually, that people have proposed at the bar or in other stimulating situations. But these are the official ones. I'm not going to try to give you all of these. I'll begin by giving you some of the more unusual theories so that you will see how far out some people can go. I apologize to the humor scholars in the audience who have heard these theories ad nauseam, but we have to dispose of them before we can go on to new things. In the last century, the French poet Baudelaire wrote an essay on comedy in which he suggested that the reason man laughs is because man is constantly aware. I'm using the generic man. If you want me to use man/woman repeatedly, if any feminist feels strongly enough, raise your hand and I'll do it. Or I'll alternate the two to make you happy. This is a habit of 40 years. It's a little difficult to break. It implies no superiority on the part of mankind. I've been married 40 years. Okay. Baudelaire suggested that man lives in a constant stage of being torn between two extremes. He is constantly aware of his superiority to the animals, but simultaneously aware of his inferiority to God and the angels. This ambivalence, this awareness tears him so that, not being able to usefully cry about it, he laughs. I list this as the first of the unusual theories in the conviction that not too many of you will accept it, but I want to introduce you to the far out ones to start with. An American psychologist named McDougall, about 50 years ago, published a book in which he argued that humor is an instinct of man. Nature, said McDougall, provided us with this instinct in order to protect us. If every time we saw somebody slip and fall, or if we saw somebody's pants fall off in an embarrassing moment, or someone spilled pie in his lap, or somebody's girdle fell off. I'm trying to get both sexes in these embarrassing situations. If every time one of these minor mishaps occurred, says McDougall, we expended energy on worrying about it, or on saying, oh my God, that's awful, or saying, gee, I sympathize with you, we wouldn't get anything done. And so nature, in her infinite wisdom, says McDougall, provided us with an instinct, and that instinct is humor, which immediately recognizes when a mishap is worth crying about or deeply sympathizing with and expending energy, or simply laughing and pleasantly getting rid of whatever energy one may have. An English psychoanalyst named J.Y.T. Grieg says, what provokes laughter in every case is, quote, the interrupted love reaction, unquote. I don't have time to work that one out for you. Stephen Leacock, who was a very funny Canadian humorist, died a few years ago. He traces humor back to this incident. The savage who cracked his enemy over the head with a tomahawk and shouted, ha ha, was the first humorist. This is a theory developed more seriously by Albert Rapp a few years ago, and he also thinks that the origin of all wit and humor was the cry of triumph of the savage when he won. And Darwin goes so far as to say that the smile is the vestigial remnant of that snarl of victory. This is still among the unusual theories that I'm introducing you to. And finally, Charlie Chaplin, who knew more about it than any of us in this room, including the speaker, Charlie Chaplin defined humor as, quote, playful pain, unquote. We'll come back to some of these in more familiar contexts. Max Eastman, an American who wrote 2 books on humor, also agrees that the sense of humor is a primary instinct of our nature. And a number of other theorists share that. I want to move from these far out unusual ones to some which are a little easier to accept with limitations. Plato, in an essay, The Philebus, says the ridiculous is based on the failure to, quote, know thyself, unquote. An Italian Renaissance scholar, Trissino, says the humorist presents base actions in order to condemn them, for laughter comes from pleasure in the low. Rochefoucauld, the great French writers of epigrams, said, wit enables us to act rudely, safely. Beaumarchais, who wrote Figaro among other things, put it this way: I laugh at everything for fear of being obliged to weep. Byron put it the same way. Byron said, I laugh so that I may not cry. A surprising number of great humorists keep mixing the two characteristics of crying and laughing as being two sides of the same coin. And Nietzsche, the German philosopher, said this: man alone suffers so excruciatingly in the world that he was compelled to invent laughter. St. John, a Catholic theorist, said, laughter does not seem to be a sin, but it leads to sin. So those of you who enjoyed Mark Russell Saturday night and Professor Weber last night probably have a number of black marks recorded in heaven. Ben Jonson, the Renaissance playwright, said, reflecting the Renaissance theory of humor, that the purpose of humor is to teach, to instruct, to ridicule the wrong things in order that human beings might be encouraged to do the right things. But John Dryden took exactly the opposite position. It helps that Dryden was writing during the Restoration when nobody was taking religious teaching very seriously. Dryden said, the purpose of comedy is to delight, not to preach, and malicious pleasure is always an ingredient of humor. We move now towards some theories which psychologists do accept, essentially the play theory, the idea that humor is play. Sully says the enjoyment of the laughable arises from the sudden arousal of the play mood, involving refusal to take the situation seriously, which is the characteristic feature of play. I'd like to reject that right now. Play alone is not funny. There are certain qualities play must have before we laugh. We don't ordinarily play and laugh at the same time. Play is pleasant, but not humorous. Thomas Carlyle said, true humor springs from the heart as well as from the head. Its essence is love, not contempt. It's very amusing that Carlyle said this. His own humor is probably the most biting and contemptuous of the 19th century, and the people who knew him best, including his wife, found him an irascible, corrosive, insulting, mean SOB. And he's the man who says, true humor springs from the heart as well as from the head. Its essence is love, not contempt. And having said that, that's the last easy laughter we get from him. Those are some of the more unusual theories. Now, the more accepted theories, the traditional and conventional ones, fall under four general categories. An excellent scholar named D.H. Monroe, in a book called Argument of Humor, broke them down into those four groups, and I think most reasonable theories of humor fall under one of or more of those. And these theories are these. First, that humor is a release from restraint. And there are several dozen different theories of that kind, which say that we laugh because we have been released from a restraint. The first of these is release from physical restraint. Spencer worked it out very carefully, that when a humorous situation is being built up by a clown, say he's going to jump off the high diving board, and a clown gets all worked up, and he measures off the distance, and he runs up once, he stops, he pulls back, and he measures it, and he starts running again. And in the meantime, presumably, says Spencer, within us, the pulse is rising, the blood is flowing to the skin, the heartbeat's increasing, we're getting tense. And finally, he runs out, and we're all ready to watch him dive. Instead, he sits down on the edge of the board and grins stupidly at us. And Spencer says, we have to do something with this energy that has been built up, see? And obviously, this is no time to cry. It's hardly worth it. And so we laugh. So in its very simplest term, the release from physical restraint is this theory. But most release theories are psychological tension rather than physical tension. And although they're associated with Sigmund Freud, many other psychologists before and after him have offered this idea that humor is a release from anxiety, hostility, or sexual pressure. And there are a large group of variants on that I'll mention in a few moments. However, an eminent psychologist named Daniel Berline, Canadian psychologist who just died a few months ago, rejects both the surplus energy theory of Spencer and the other physiological theorists, and the discharge of psychic energy theory of Freud and the psychoanalysts. Berline claims our present knowledge of how the nervous system functions eliminates both the Freudian and Spencerian explanation and makes them obsolete. And he quotes the Chinese expression, I'm so angry, I can laugh. That's a relief theory. The next one that's common is the incongruity theory. I'm going to give you four major theories. The first was release from restraint. The second is incongruity. A great many people are convinced that all you need for things to be funny is to have them be incongruous, inappropriate, unfitting. Certain kinds of inappropriateness, disharmony, and impropriety result in amusement, according to this theory. Kessler, for example, says all humorous situations are variants of, quote, bisociation of form and function, the whole and the part, unquote. In other words, if I were wearing a clown's cap now and a pair of bathing suits, he thinks that would be amusing because there would be a clash between form and function. That would not be the appropriate clothes for a 3 o'clock lecture to a distinguished audience of this kind. And he thinks all humor is based like that. Immanuel Kant, we always have to mention Kant, says, laughter is the affectation arising from the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing. For example, Dorothy Parker's book review of a writer she was reviewing for the New Yorker. He's a writer for the ages of 4 to 8. Schopenhauer also felt that incongruity explained this theory. The third large group of accepted theories comes under ambivalence. Ambivalence is the simultaneous experience of contradictory emotions. Simultaneous conflicting feelings towards a person, such as loving and hating at the same time. We laugh when hearing an anecdote or seeing an incident we find opposing emotions struggling within us. The trouble with this theory is that all the scholars who support this theory offer different emotions as being the ones in the ambivalent condition. No two of them agree. Grieg has love and hate, some have fear and relaxation, some have other things, but there's no agreement whatsoever among them. One says largeness and smallness, one says dignity and lack of it, but they do not agree on which ambivalent condition causes laughter. One scholar, James Beatty, says the cause of laughter is an opposition of suitableness and unsuitableness. A recent scholar following the anthropologist, the French anthropologist, takes the position that the ambivalence is a conflict between culture and nature. And whenever we feel a situation in which our natural instinct, our desire, nature, conflicts with culture. For instance, if one of you is already bored enough to want to stretch out on the chairs there and take a little nap, your instinct is to sleep. But culture, in the form of societal pressures, at least this early in the hour, keeps you looking up and pretending to be happy and fascinated and grinning at the proper moments and all of that. So there is this expression of ambivalence. There are a great many of them, including one that I will offer later in my own theory. And finally, the fourth major group, superiority theories. This one goes back a long way, but Hobbes is most often quoted, a 17th century English philosopher, so I'll quote Hobbes. The passion of laughter is nothing else but sudden glory arising from some sudden conception of an eminency in ourselves by comparison with the infirmity of others or with our own infirmity formerly. A great many scholars have supported this position. Aristotle, Plato in part. The general idea is this. We laugh because we feel superior to someone else in a situation which is not dangerous, which is not cruel or sadistic or something of that kind. What I want to do now is take one example of common humor and apply each of these four theories to show you how each group would interpret it. One of the basic jokes is to throw a pie in someone's face, preferably a cream pie. It's messier and so on. And preferably throwing it in the face of someone who is formally dressed and who is dignified and so on. There's not much humor in dropping an apple pie on a baby in a crib. But if at this moment somebody threw a lemon meringue pie at me and hit me, there'd be a considerable amount of happiness. Unmalicious, but there, present. Let's interpret that very familiar joke by these four basic theories. The release from restraint people will say, each of us is always under some tension. Some of you in this room told me you took an hour off from work today to come hear this eminent contribution to knowledge and wisdom, but it's costing you $3.25 an hour, and you're wondering how the boss feels about it. And that's the least tension that there is here. Everybody else has something on his or her mind. If nothing else, the fate of the ISU basketball team should keep you tense enough and worried enough. So if we accept the statement that essentially this is true, that everybody all the time has what we call normal people have, a certain amount of dissatisfaction, worry, and so on. We're not sending it to the nut house. We're just talking about normal tensions, problems, and so on. Okay. Seeing this minor mishap, which obviously is not serious, is not important, nevertheless, according to the release from restraint theorists, permits you to get rid of some of that tension, to laugh, to relax, to get that psychological pleasure of doing it. We're doing this at a very simple level. We'll get to the psychologists later. The second group, the incongruity people, say, well, obviously we're laughing because the normal dress for a lecturer at a university omits meringue pie as part of the costume. It's incongruous. Not too many professors walk around with pie dripping off their faces and on their suits. It's incongruity. I'd like to point out to you that we only laugh at incongruity when it involves inferiority. That pie on my face makes me, at least momentarily, inferior to everybody here because I'm embarrassed. I'm in an awkward situation. You take a quick look. You don't have pie dripping off your face. You're socially acceptable. You're okay. I'm not okay. And for that happy moment, you laugh. But notice that the incongruity must put the person in an inferior position. The third theory, ambivalence. You're sympathetic to me as another human being, but you're pleased. That's nice to see somebody embarrassed in this way. So the ambivalence is between sympathy and pleasure. And finally, the fourth theory, the superiority theory, is very obvious. Normally, students sit lower than the professor, are lower in the pecking order, get the grades instead of give them, and it's a very nice feeling to reverse the situation. During the Middle Ages in France, they used to set aside a whole week, and the Catholic Church supported it. This is even before Protestantism, so the Catholic Church was the only church. A week of reversal, carnivals, where a fool would be appointed to act as pope during that week and wear the pope's clothes or clothes resembling it. Other people would look like the cardinals. They'd recite a black mass instead of the real one. And for a week, people would go around swearing, playing games, doing the things in public that normally you don't do. At the end of the week, back, and so on. Well, this is part of that same reversal. There are many cultures in the world which do this. There have been recent studies of South American tribes, Central American tribes, which have regular weekly or weekend activities of this kind in which the normal order is reversed. Somebody's appointed mayor, somebody's appointed police chief, whereas the real officers are ridiculed, insulted, and have to take it, but only for that short period of time. So superiority is the basis of this particular theory. I want to mention one more theory expressed by a number of people. Quintilian, who lived in the 1st century AD, a Roman, said, "No one has yet satisfactorily expressed what laughter is, though many have tried it." This is going to be repeated a number of times. Edward Thorndike says, "The complete elucidation of laughter has not yet been included in any simple explanation." And an eminent recent psychologist, G. Stanley Hall, says, "All current theories of laughter are utterly inadequate and speculative." Even more impressive than this, a few years ago there was a book published called The Psychology of Humor, an anthology of recent experiments by modern psychologists in humor. And Professor McGee, the co-editor of that, admits in the introduction, he said, there's an enormous amount of work here with cognition and recognition and emotion and this and that, and this is very interesting material, but the truth is, after having read all of this, I must say, I haven't the faintest idea what humor is. McGee is honest enough to make that admission. Other people are not. I want to take a few minutes to give you some of the theories about humor expressed by psychologists. These may seem to you much farther out than the first group of unusual ones, but they belong in a group by themselves. The best known, of course, of this group is Freud. And his theory is that the pleasure of wit derives from economy of expenditure in inhibition. The pleasure of the comic derives from economy of expenditure in thought. And the pleasure of humor from economy of expenditure in feeling. Don't worry about this. I think there's sheer nonsense. There's no way of breaking up the three. What one person calls wit, someone else calls humor, and a third person calls comic. Freud, because he broke up the psyche into the ego and the superego and the id, played little games in which he thought they really function in that kind of military arrangement with each other. But I do want to mention these to you. He says there are two kinds of wit: harmless wit, indulged for its own sake, and tendency wit, which permits us to gratify our repressed hostility to others and our repressed sexual desires. Society, according to Freud, acts as a censor to these drives. It says, no, no. Take the hostility drive. There's somebody you don't like. You'd like to punch him in the nose. Society says, no, no. Policeman says, no, no. But you're permitted to insult him or her wittily. Then society laughs, and you get rid of the hostile drive. The other drive, the sexual drive, Freud says, there are more dirty jokes than any other kind of jokes in the world. And the reason they exist is they permit people to get rid of sexual desires in this socially accepted way. That's why Playboy magazine exists, and the early part of Playboy is so popular with scholarly readers. Freud is much more complicated than this, but Freudianism is not very seriously taken now by most psychiatrists. I'll go to another one, Martin Grotjahn, another psychoanalyst. He says laughter is based on guilt-free release of aggression. The sophisticated outlet for aggression. And I want to take a moment for one other psychoanalyst, Dr. Edmund Bergler, who has a very interesting theory. Bergler says every human being lives with the guilt of the nursery. Each of us, when we were children, found moments when we resented the fact, don't take this too seriously, and this is not I speaking, this is Dr. Bergler, Herr Dr. Professor Bergler of Vienna. Okay? Okay. Every human being, as an infant, went through certain periods of resentment when mother didn't gratify his or her every wish. At first, at birth, every wish is gratified. Baby is hungry, it's fed. Baby wants to yell, mama or papa carries it around. Baby makes a mess, somebody cleans up and says, isn't that cute? After a few months, the mood changes, according to Bergler. And the baby begins recognizing a certain lack of enthusiasm on the part of his father when he howls his head off at 3 a.m. And when he takes his cereal and splashes it on Mother's face, he begins to suspect that Mother does not think this is very desirable behavior. And when on occasion he has messed up his pants and tries some artistic arrangements with the equipment, and Mother expresses either repressed irritation or bangs him over the head, he begins to feel that he's not getting the love that he started with. And of course, as he gets older, and if there are other children in the family, and especially if another child is born shortly afterward, he begins to feel resentment. Now, according to Bergler, the normal child expresses this resentment by yelling, by screaming, by throwing, by breaking, and he or she grows up to be just like you and me, ideal citizens, admirable examples of normalcy. But some babies repress this hostility and try to get revenge at Mother for having betrayed them. And what they do is imagine that Mother is punished for her treatment of them, punished by death. Bergler never explains how a 6-month-old baby knows what death is, but apparently it's one of those secrets psychoanalysts know that they don't share with us. Now, those people become neurotics when they grow up, or psychotics, and they go through life with a deep feeling of guilt about this act that they committed. But even the rest of us, according to Bergler, you and I, we too, as we grow up, have a strong feeling of guilt because we never quite match the perfect behavior which our Sunday school teaches us, which our teachers teach us, which our parents insist, be honest, be good, be nice, work hard, and all that. Few of us have achieved, a few I can see in the audience have achieved that level of perfection, but the rest of us failed miserably. And we walk around with this sense of guilt. According to Bergler, whenever we see somebody else failing in public to achieve perfection, we get a warm glow. Ah, he too, or she too. See? Edith Bunker, she's a dummy, see? I may be stupid, but she's really a dummy. Or on the Mary Tyler Moore Show a few years ago, Ted the announcer. Now, that's a pompous ass. I may sometimes pretend in public, but compared to him, I'm pure as the driven snow, and so on. And so Bergler suggests that laughter is really a release of hidden guilt on the part of all of us except saints. And the number of saints, even in central Iowa, has been limited even on days of the caucus. Okay. What I've given you then is a very quick view of the traditional theories of humor. What I want to do now is tell you my theory of humor without the slightest expectation that anybody will accept it or be more impressed by it than a recent reviewer who said he liked the book, but he was very disappointed. The title of the book is The Secret of Humor, and it turned out that the secret of humor was playful aggression. He said that's quite disappointing. I suppose Einstein must have felt guilty at simply giving a formula for energy, which was just 3 letters and a number. The fact is that nobody previously has tried to explain humor as being playful aggression. It may seem to you ridiculously simple, but humor is a simple thing. Children laugh. There's an excellent book on children's laughter by Dr. Winterstein. She picks them up very early, and she says they laugh early, and they always laugh either at inferior incongruity or to express aggression from the age 5 or 6 on up. Now, the children she studied may have been peculiar. They were New Yorkers instead of Iowan. But there is some suspicion that this is a broader characteristic than that. To put it very simply, then, I think that that's essentially what humor is. It is playful aggression. It varies enormously. Some humor is mostly aggression and very little playfulness, and some of it is mostly playfulness and very little aggression. When Mark Russell gave that delightful program of his Saturday night, he ran the whole gamut. And when he was playing with words, like sloth and so on, we had a minimum of criticism or aggression. We had a maximum of playfulness. And the pun is a form of playfulness. But when he took those shots at Carter and Kennedy and Connolly, it was mostly aggression and a minimum of playfulness. And I'm sure that each of those victims felt there was even more aggression and even less playfulness in each of those barbs when he expressed them. I think that all humor in the world is based on playful aggression. I want to express it very simply and then give you some examples to illustrate what I have in mind. There's a cliche that we English teachers often quote. In tragedy, we suffer with the characters. In humor, we laugh at the characters. Think of your popular TV comedy, whichever your favorites are, and see if you don't laugh at the people in them. When we laugh with people, we are always laughing simultaneously at someone else or at something else. This is the usual argument against this. They say, no, sometimes you're laughing with somebody. Every time you laugh with somebody, you are laughing at somebody else or at something else. Think for a moment of Johnny Carson's monologues at the beginning of his program. They are directed at individuals whom he ridicules. Think of Bob Hope's monologues. All of them are at the expense of somebody, sometimes also something. Mark Russell gave us a delightful hour ridiculing people and activities. We didn't feel vicious while we did it, but it was aggression. It was expressed playfully, and when you add a piano, it makes it even more playful. But the hostility is there. The incongruities we laugh at are always inferior incongruities. Again, the incongruity people say, that's not true. All right? In a grammar school room, whom do the kids laugh at? The smartest child in the room or the dumbest? But being smart is just as incongruous as being stupid. Whom do they laugh at? The most handsome child in the room or the ugliest? But being the handsomest is just as incongruous as being the ugliest. Do they laugh at the slowest or the fattest student? The incongruity is the same. We always laugh at the inferior. We don't laugh at the superior. At the coronation of the Queen of England, certainly her dress and her costume are incongruous. We don't laugh at it. We think that's superior incongruity. But let somebody run with a loincloth through this room, and you would laugh because you think that's inferior to whatever habits we happen to have. A psychologist, Jacob Levine, says sex and aggression are the main themes of humor because they are the primary sources of most human conflicts and tensions. Let me read that again so each of you can test it for yourself without raising your hands in response. Sex and aggression are the main themes of humor because they are the primary sources of most human conflicts and tensions. And Legman, who wrote the biggest collection of dirty jokes in the English language, Grove Press, will be glad to sell it to you at a reduced price. 2,000 dirty jokes. Under the mask of humor, our society allows infinite aggressions by everyone and against everyone. Psychologists tell us that kidding is always a release of aggression. Anytime you tease somebody or you kid, you are putting that person in the position of a kid and yourself in a superior position, and you're ridiculing. Sidney Harris, a columnist, says, the traditional clown embodies the spirit of animosity. And Al Capp, who wrote the Little Abner strip, said, and he should know, the essence of humor is man's inhumanity to man. Inhumanity to man. And finally, James Thurber, that beloved, gentle humorist, until Brendan Gill wrote his book about him. Thurber said, the best humor is, quote, the familiar, which is humiliating, distressing, tragic. And that is perhaps our greatest 20th century humorist. The best humor, he said, is that which is humiliating, distressing, tragic. And this is our sophisticated humor. This isn't the cornball humor of the West or the barroom. This is the best humor in America, the New Yorker magazine. And finally, Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, said, humor is always directed against the deviant. It is society's way of protecting itself against the nonconformist, so that each society ridicules whoever doesn't behave the way society wants him to behave, even though that behavior may be different in each society. I want to give you my theory of humor very briefly in outline. I say all humor is playful aggression. There are certain forms of aggression which are very easy to demonstrate. I won't waste time on that. I'm sure you'll agree that practical jokes are a form of aggression. I might mention in the early days of aviation, the American commercial pilot who in bad weather used to walk through the cabin carrying a book, How to Fly in 20 Easy Lessons. If the aggression isn't there, you'll never see it. Smith wrote an excellent collection called The Complete Practical Joker. He claims that Americans indulge in practical jokes more than any other civilization, and he has a marvelous collection. But every one of those practical jokes is at the expense of somebody. It expresses hostility, aggression, superiority. The witty insult is obviously a form of aggression. When Dorothy Parker went out on a date with a very dull companion, and toward the end of the evening, he leaned back pompously and said to her, you know, I can't bear fools. And she said, that's strange, your mother could. That kind of witty insult pleases on another occasion, she had a very unpleasant date, who was insulting and boorish. And then when he took her to her door, he said, I'm sorry, I really behaved badly tonight. And she said, that's all right, but when you get home, throw a bone to your mother. That one takes one more step, but it's even more devastating. And I have a chapter here loaded with obvious examples of aggression of the kind that nobody disputes and so on. So I'll skip those. The original part of my theory begins here. What I try to do is explain all forms of laughter in these categories. First, the humor of unexpected truth, I claim, is aggression against hypocrisy. When Dennis the Menace, for instance, comes running home, he finds a woman visitor sitting on a sofa talking to his mother, and Dennis says, oh, so the fat lady did come to visit, huh, Ma? Unexpected truth. The hypocrisy is we're not supposed to mention people's fatness in public. And that's done at a number of levels. The level of the ignorant, that's Dennis the Menace, the child. The level of the fool, or the court fool. And at the other extreme, the level of the sophisticate. In Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde has a marvelous example of the witty sophisticate who expresses unpleasant truths because he is above society's displeasure. He doesn't give a damn. See, the child doesn't know enough to be bothered. It's below the level of society's expression. So it can express the truth in ignorance. The sophisticate is above it. He doesn't care. He can express unpleasant truths and not worry about it. Obviously, this wouldn't work unless society were full of hypocrisy. And I assume that it is. I go farther, I'll say, the more civilized a society is, the more hypocritical it is. Much of that hypocrisy consists of what we consider nice hypocrisy. I hesitate to use the word nice after Mark Russell's song about have a nice day. But pleasant hypocrisy. In other words, if somebody, a friend of ours, comes and says, gee, what do you think of that new hat I just bought? You don't say that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. You say, well, that's certainly interesting. We're being hypocritical, but for a kind purpose. But life is full of hypocrisy. We rarely are permitted to say what we believe. Because of this hypocrisy, whenever somebody violates these restrictions, whenever somebody tells the truth at an embarrassing moment, at a socially inconvenient moment, we're delighted. Another group of humor, sexual humor. I suggest it's aggression against inhibitions. We enjoy dirty jokes. I use the term dirty not because I think they're dirty, but because it's the blue is artificial. Why not yellow or orange? So we enjoy dirty jokes because they allow us to get around an inhibition. If one of the young men in the audience developed a sudden lust for one of the young women sitting next to him, wouldn't be difficult to do, a lot of attractive young women here, you wouldn't grab her and kiss her immediately. You have to inhibit that perfectly natural desire. Freud says we do that much of the time. Even our president admitted having a lust in his heart, although he repressed it more than most people do, somewhat more successfully than Hugh Hefner does. Sexual humor, then, I think, is aggression against inhibitions. You'll forgive me if I don't give you any examples at this point. I'm a distinguished professor and would like to keep that rating. The next group is scatological humor. Scatos was the Greek word for feces, dung. And the term scatological humor refers to any references to bathroom activities, private parts of the body, and so on. Again, why do we laugh when people make those references in public? I suggest to you it's aggression against propriety. We have been trained that it's not nice to do that. We may have to indulge in these activities all the time. We know that everybody does it, or he's going to be awfully sick, but we pretend that these don't exist. We have only spirits and minds, no bodies, no mess, no dirt. Propriety, artificiality. When someone uses the four-letter words referring to the physical functions, we enjoy it, I think, because it expresses aggression against propriety. There's a group of jokes or witticisms which I put under cosmic humor. This is aggression against the design of the universe. This is perhaps the very highest level of humor. It's what Mark Twain tried to do in The Mysterious Stranger. It's what philosophers have tried to do. It's Waiting for Godot tries to do that kind of thing. It's essentially a protest. The theater of the absurd has a lot of that. It's an attempt to protest against the way God has arranged the universe. We can see lots of things wrong, and we wish nature or God or fate had arranged it better than X did. This is aggression against the design of the universe. There's another group which is more popular now than ever called black humor. This has nothing to do with black people. This is not the humor of the Negro or of the African. We use the term black here to mean bitter humor, the humor of people like Lenny Bruce, the grotesque humor. It may interest you to know that there have been periods of what they used to call grotesque humor, we call it black humor, in the 16th century in Europe, in the 18th century, and now. A scholar named Kaiser, who tried to trace it, explains it as flourishing at times when people's sense of certainty is gone, when people lose their faith in God, rightness, order in the universe, when people feel things are crumbling or are not under control, when people get attacked by rabbits when they go out in rowboats. Things are pretty shaky at a time like that. And black humor, I suggest to you, is aggression against everything. The people who do the black humor, and a lot of it is on Saturday Night Live. Much of it isn't funny, but it's certainly aggressive. Perhaps the most familiar example of black humor in American humor is the remark, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? That gives you an idea of the thing. There are much meaner ones now in my examples in my book, but I don't have time to give them to you. I think up to this point, most people would be willing to accept my theory and agree that in Unexpected Truth, as aggression against hypocrisy, sexual humor, aggression against inhibitions, scatological humor, aggression against propriety, cosmic humor, aggression against the design of the universe, and black humor, aggression against everything, I think you would easily recognize the hostility present. There are two more groups on which the aggression theory usually founders and which my theory may founder on. These next two groups are the ones in which previous efforts to support or defend the aggression theory have failed. And these are the two groups. How do you explain nonsense humor? And how do you explain wordplay? People have said to me after I've given lectures of this kind in different parts of the world, they've said, well, I'll go along with you so far, but I just can't believe that puns are a form of aggression. that wordplay expresses hostility or that nonsense humor in any way is malicious. Let me propose to you this possible answer. I suggest to you that nonsense humor is aggression against logic and order. Nonsense humor pleases us because you students, more than anybody else, are constantly subjected to having to think reasonably, logically, go from point one to point two, from main premise, minor premise, conclusion, and so on. Our life in a technical society demands that we subjugate our professional work to reason, logic. And from Schopenhauer on, a number of scholars have suggested we get damn tired of this. Schopenhauer called this the tyranny of reason. We want to revolt against the tyranny of reason, and nonsense humor, he says, does that for us. And finally, wordplay. I suggest to you that the pun and wordplay and the limerick is aggression against conformity, that we twist words out of shape because we enjoy breaking rules, changing things from the way they normally are. I had hoped to give you some examples. I won't have time for it, but I do want to tie up what I have said to the humor, to American humor, which is the theme of this week's conference. I published a book called Asian Laughter. All of the examples in that book, without my intending to do so, since I didn't have my theory of humor developed at the time that book was published, do demonstrate playful aggression. I'm working now on a study of world humor, the rest of the world, in which I think also the same thing is true. If it's true for the humor of the world, I think it's true for American humor. Now, Professor Weber, in his speech last night, made reference to his anthology of American literature, in which he did us the great service in his anthology of showing that many of the great American writers, whom we normally think of as tragic writers or somber writers, had a sense of humor, that some of them used that sense of humor in their serious writing, others wrote humorous things separately from the other. So we have his evidence to the presence of humor in the best American literature. Professor Berger proved in his study of the American comic strip, the comic stripped American, he called it, how much hostility, how much aggression, how much repressed unhappiness there is in what we consider our funnies. Lucy and Charlie Brown, Doonesbury is nothing but hostility. The only difference in Doonesbury each day is who is being slugged. Pogo, Little Abner. The most popular ones, Blondie. You can read Berger's book, and he demonstrates his case effectively. And finally, another American scholar, Jesse Beer, in another anthology of American literature, reached this conclusion. He called his book The Rise and Fall of American Humor. He is convinced that from the start, although less obviously then, when we had the humor of the frontier, American humor depended on vulgarity, crudity, hostility. Now he thinks it's reached an even more intense level of that kind. And he says in his book, American humor is filled with skepticism, cruelty, and derogation. Its prime function is antithetical. That means against things. It is a genre of deflation, and the chief risk of American humor is misanthropy and nihilism, unquote. I don't want to end on that cheerless note. Obviously, as Mark Russell demonstrated, American humor can be critical and deflationary and delightful, and I think useful. I think that humor serves an enormously important purpose in society. It permits us to get rid of irritations, frustrations. Students at Iowa State University and graduates here are, of course, subjected to fewer frustrations and irritations and failures than ordinary human beings are. But in this imperfect world, even we, from time to time, are subjected to pressures of that kind. The easiest way in the world to get rid of those pressures is through laughter. Humor is the cheapest therapy in the world. Thank you.